President Trump has announced sweeping universal tariffs on all foreign imports, hitting not just adversaries but longtime allies like the European Union. The decision triggered global market instability and immediate backlash from international leaders. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen responded swiftly. In a firm and deliberate statement, she condemned the tariffs as reckless and harmful to both sides of the Atlantic. She warned of severe consequences for the global economy and made it clear that Europe would retaliate. Her message was sharp. These tariffs would hurt consumers, businesses, and vulnerable countries. Supply chains would suffer, inflation would rise, and uncertainty would grow. If the US insists on confrontation, the EU is ready to respond. This video covers Trump's aggressive trade move, von der Leyen's chilling warning, and why this standoff may redefine global trade alliances. Trump's trade shock, a worldwide gut punch. President Donald Trump stood at the podium with the confidence of a man delivering what he believed was a long overdue correction to global trade. "We're putting tariffs on everyone," he declared. "It's time the world stops taking advantage of America." With those words, he shattered decades of carefully negotiated economic relationships. This wasn't a limited measure aimed at a handful of countries or industries. The new tariffs applied universally, from heavy machinery and automobiles to food products and consumer goods. The message was blunt. If it crosses into US borders, it gets taxed. Steel and aluminum were just the beginning. Coffee, textiles, cars, nothing was spared. Even traditional allies like the European Union, Canada, and Japan were offered no exemptions, no back channels, and no time to adjust. The global response was immediate and severe. Markets reacted with panic. Major stock indices dropped across the board as uncertainty flooded trading floors. Investors pulled back. Currency volatility surged. Countries and corporations alike scrambled to model the potential fallout. Economists warned of disrupted supply chains, inflation spikes, and rising costs for consumers. Within hours, it was clear. This wasn't a strategic negotiation. It was an economic shockwave, one that caught even America's closest partners off guard. The impact of the US tariffs rippled across the globe, but nowhere was the reaction more urgent than in Europe. As financial markets staggered and multinational corporations braced for disruption, leaders within the European Union were forced to confront a harsh new reality. What had once been a stable transatlantic partnership was now under open economic assault. With the shock still fresh, attention in Brussels shifted quickly, from disbelief to response. The question was no longer if the EU would act, but how and when. The EU's staggered response, shock turns to strategy. The initial reaction from Europe was one of stunned silence. The sheer scale and abruptness of the US tariff decision left European officials momentarily frozen, not out of hesitation, but calculation. As the news settled, the silence gave way to urgency. Behind closed doors, phones rang, emergency meetings were scheduled, and consultations intensified between EU capitals. What began as disbelief quickly turned into deliberate strategy. European leaders saw the tariffs not only as an economic threat, but as a political provocation. It wasn't just the cost of goods or the potential market losses. It was the symbolism of being cast aside alongside adversaries after decades of alliance and cooperation. The message from Washington was clear. Friendship offered no immunity. Ursula von der Leyen emerged as the face of the EU's response. Her leadership in this moment was defined by precision and resolve. While emotions ran high, her tone remained measured. There were no outbursts, only clarity. She framed the tariffs as damaging not only to Europe, but to the global economy. She made it clear that the EU would not respond emotionally, but it would respond decisively. The response began taking shape in stages: internal evaluations of economic exposure, strategic talks with other affected partners, and preparation of countermeasures. European institutions moved quickly to identify sectors where retaliation would be both legal under international rules and politically effective. What was originally perceived as a shocking move by the US was being met with calm, coordinated determination from Brussels. Behind the scenes, preparations were underway. European leaders had begun mapping out their countermeasures, identifying strategic sectors to hit back. But before any policy was implemented, the EU needed to send a clear message, one that matched the gravity of the situation and left no room for misinterpretation. It was Ursula von der Leyen who would deliver it. As the face of the European response, she stepped forward not just to speak for Brussels, but for an entire continent. And what followed wasn't just a statement, it was a warning the world couldn't ignore. Von der Leyen's warning. As the European Union finalized its initial response, Ursula von der Leyen stepped forward to deliver a message that would resonate far beyond Brussels. Her tone was steady, but the content of her statement carried unmistakable weight. She laid out the real-world consequences of the tariffs with clarity and precision. Rising inflation, more expensive groceries and medication, and increased hardship for everyday citizens across Europe and beyond. The economic cost wouldn't be abstract, it would hit where people felt it most: their wallets, their pantries, and their access to essentials. What made her warning so potent wasn't just the facts, it was the way she positioned Europe's stance. This wasn't a matter of business or policy disagreements, it was something deeper. Von der Leyen made it clear that this was a line being crossed, a turning point in how allies treat one another. Trade had become the new weapon, and this action by the US was nothing short of an act of aggression through economic means. More than just a defense of European markets, her message was a declaration of unity. The European Union, often criticized for internal divisions, now stood as a bloc. The tariffs had done something rare. They had united 27 nations with a singular voice. Von der Leyen emphasized that any attack on one member was an attack on all, and that the EU would respond as one. The language was calm, but the intent was unmistakable. Europe was ready to stand its ground. Von der Leyen's warning set the tone, but it was only the beginning. Words alone would not be enough to shift the course of US trade policy. The European Union knew it had to respond in a way that was both impactful and measured, something that would demonstrate strength without spiraling into uncontrolled escalation. The next phase was already in motion: economic countermeasures designed to apply pressure exactly where it would hurt the most. Strategic countermeasures targeting America's pressure points. The European Union's response was anything but reactionary. This wasn't about anger or symbolism. It was about strategy. Behind closed doors, EU officials carefully analyzed trade data, political dynamics, and regional dependencies. Their goal was to identify specific sectors within the US economy that would feel the impact quickly and visibly. It wasn't about mirroring the scale of the tariffs. It was about precision, influence, and leverage. The result was a targeted list of $23 billion worth of American goods slated for retaliatory tariffs. These weren't random selections. The list included high-profile products like textiles, soybeans, bourbon, steel, and even Harley-Davidson motorcycles, exports that represented more than just economic value. These were industries rooted in the American heartland, many of them tied to states and districts with political significance. By aiming at these pressure points, the EU made it clear that the consequences of the US decision wouldn't just be economic, they would be political. The message was calculated. The European Union would not be bullied, and it wouldn't lash out blindly. Instead, it would strike where it mattered most, forcing American lawmakers and voters to feel the effects at home. This wasn't just retaliation, it was a tactical maneuver designed to make Washington reconsider its approach to global trade. Global fallout. Who really pays for tariffs? Trade wars rarely remain confined to the corridors of power. Once policies are signed and tariffs imposed, their effects spread rapidly into everyday life. In factories across Europe, particularly in countries like Germany and Austria, workers began facing uncertain futures. Industries that relied on American components or exported goods to US markets were suddenly exposed to new costs, delays, and disruptions. Production lines slowed, orders were canceled, jobs were quietly put on hold. In the markets and grocery stores of Spain, France, and beyond, families began noticing subtle but steady price increases. Meat, dairy, packaged goods, items with even indirect exposure to global trade became more expensive. It wasn't long before these shifts started cutting into household budgets, especially among middle and working class families already managing inflation pressures from other fronts. Outside the EU, developing nations felt the squeeze too. Many smaller economies that relied on integrated trade systems saw their exports stall and their own imports become costlier due to disrupted supply chains. These countries, often without the buffers and reserves of larger powers, found themselves forced to adjust quickly or suffer deeper setbacks. What became painfully evident was that the very people populist trade policies claimed to protect, workers, families, and small business owners, were among the first to bear the burden. Tariffs may have been launched in the name of sovereignty and fairness, but the costs were landing squarely on the shoulders of those with the least power to influence them. As the economic impact spread, one question lingered in the minds of citizens and business leaders alike: was anyone trying to stop this? With livelihoods at stake and tensions rising, many hoped that quiet diplomacy might succeed where public statements had failed. The truth is, efforts were indeed underway, but they revealed just how far apart the two sides really were. Back channels and breakdown, the diplomacy you didn't see. While public rhetoric intensified, diplomatic channels quietly came alive. Behind the carefully worded speeches and bold warnings, teams of negotiators from both the US and the European Union engaged in urgent discussions. Video calls, encrypted messages, and private meetings were held in attempts to de-escalate the crisis before it reached a point of no return. For a moment, it seemed as though diplomacy might prevail. One of the boldest ideas came from Brussels, a zero-for-zero agreement that would eliminate tariffs on industrial goods from both sides entirely. The proposal was simple and powerful, a reset button that could restore balance and rebuild trust. It was met with interest by some within the US administration, but ultimately rejected at the highest level. Washington, under Trump's leadership, insisted on unilateral terms and guarantees that Europe was not willing to concede. As negotiations stalled, it became clear that the divide wasn't just about trade, it was philosophical. The European Union was advocating for multilateralism, cooperation, and long-term stability. The Trump administration, on the other hand, focused on immediate leverage, national advantage, and transactional wins. The language of diplomacy began to break down under the weight of incompatible goals. Ursula von der Leyen made the EU's position clear. They were prepared to remove barriers and reach a fair agreement, but not under threat or pressure. With little progress and no compromise in sight, optimism faded. The diplomatic road was narrowing fast, and each day without resolution brought both sides closer to a hardened standoff. The big picture, a test of alliances, a fight for the future. What began as a tariff dispute over goods and market access has evolved into something far more consequential. This standoff between the United States and the European Union is no longer just about steel, soybeans, or subsidies. It's about the deeper infrastructure that holds global alliances together: trust, cooperation, and shared economic principles. The confrontation has exposed rifts not only in trade policy, but in how nations define fairness, loyalty, and strategic partnership in a rapidly shifting world. At its core, this moment represents a broader test. Countries around the globe are closely watching how two of the world's most powerful economic entities handle disagreement. The focus isn't solely on what tariffs are imposed or which goods are affected. It's about how each side chooses to wield its influence. Will they lean into confrontation for short-term political gain, or step back and lead with diplomacy and restraint? The stakes extend well beyond the borders of the US and EU. Other nations are recalibrating their own trade relationships, assessing risks, and preparing for what could become a prolonged period of economic uncertainty. The decisions made now could shape the next decade of global commerce, impacting everything from investment flows to supply chain structures. As the dust begins to settle, one fact is unavoidable: the cost of escalation is immense, but the cost of doing nothing, of allowing relationships to fracture and cooperation to dissolve, may be even greater. The final message from Europe remains cautiously open. Confrontation can still give way to dialogue. There is still time to turn back from the brink and return to a table where negotiation, not punishment, guides the future. Whether that opportunity is seized remains to be seen.